They warned us that we could encounter skin, hair, and flesh in the recovery.
They were risk takers crazy enough to maybe get in this death machine.
They had all their, doubts, and there was a lot of praying going on, everything.
Crew's remains were entombed in mud inside an iron coffin, which was then buried. There was an entire spinal column. We apply the same basic investigative techniques as crime scene investigators. We're doing the same thing, we're just doing it for extremely cold cases.
Think of it as a 3D jigsaw puzzle where pieces fit together.
It tells us about life at the time, how people lived, how they died.
But she very jealously has held on to that last secret.
It's almost like a form of insanity, you go after it with such fervor. We really want to know what happened and how things developed, and we're interested in all sorts of aspects, not just the piece of metal or wood or whatever that was a vessel, a sailing vessel, but the people that went and why they went.
The War of the States raged, ravaging farm and factory, leaving the South as well as the North disassembled and struggling to reunite as well as recover. Casualties were catastrophic and sporadically reported. Battlefields are said to still be haunted by spirits of the fallen, their stories largely untold. By war's end, 2 fabled vessels surrounded in mystery lay quietly and undisturbed hundreds of feet below the turbulent surface of the Atlantic Ocean, the slow sway of its floor further concealing their secrets.
In response to the Confederates' decision to build an ironclad, the United States Congress authorized the Navy to build 3 of them, all of them experimental. And the Monitor was the first of those to be completed, and it was of a radical new design. Very flat-bottomed hull, very low freeboard, with a turret, rotating turret with the guns.
Initially, the Monitor was kind of this cockamamie, crazy concept of a vessel that most people thought wouldn't even float. It's primarily metal, most of it's iron.
There was a lot of skepticism about its seaworthiness. There was even speculation that it would sink like a stone.
But the ironclad USS Monitor, often referred to as a cheese box, became a model for shipbuilding, and in some ways changed the way battles were fought at sea.
So it actually prevented, the South or the Confederacy to move into the North. And I would say, what they said at that time, the Monitor saved the Union.
It became the prototype for more than 40 ironclads built on the Monitor design in the Union Navy, which played a major role in Union victory in the Civil War.
If the Monitor at first appeared unstable, the Confederates, a few years later, launched a veritable death trap. The 4-foot 3-inch hull of the H.L Hunley didn't even allow its crew to stand. It was hand-cranked and designed to ram explosives into Union ships from below the water's surface.
Here was something revolutionary. That was the first submarine in the world to go out and sink an enemy ship and change for all times how war would be fought on the water. So she's almost a historical icon.
Hunley also proved victorious in battle, but otherwise lethal. Both the Hunley and the Monitor were lost at sea, then hunted for more than a century. Both reflected the American Revolution of commerce and industry. Both were the result of man's desperate determination to be victorious. And both exacted extraordinary bravery and patriotism from their crews.
It's the story of a people who, in the pursuit of defense of liberty, have always been willing to put aside the element of fear and answer the call of duty.
The call of duty sounded for naval warriors in the spring of 1861. Rather than leave her in enemy hands, Union forces burned and sank USS Merrimack at the Norfolk, Virginia Navy Yard. But Confederates, recognizing the usefulness of her hull, raised the ship and went about building an iron casemate. She was relaunched as the ironclad CSS Virginia. It was a man named John Erickson who engineered the Union's rebuttal.
But for the most part, it's this big, flat iron thing with a round gun turret on top. And most sailors were used to big wooden sailing vessels, the big glorious ships that you see with multiple masts and 40 cannons. This was completely different. 2 guns, steam-powered, hot, sweaty, coal-driven, and it's not something that men were just leaping at the opportunity to serve aboard.
They were sort of written off by some of their friends and family for having volunteered in this iron coffin, as it was called at the time. All previous ships had guns in broadside and deck guns, pivot guns, but the turret could fire in any direction.
2 guns, one could fire while the other was reloaded, moved back and forth on carriages inside the turret, which was covered in 8 inches of iron plating. Crew members looked out through small holes in the armor. It wasn't pretty, but turns out it worked. In March of 1862 at Hampton Roads, Virginia, the ironclad CSS Virginia attacked 2 Union ships, USS Cumberland and USS Congress, sinking them both. Union frigate USS Minnesota ran aground, but the Virginia was unable to finish her off before daylight's end.
And when the Virginia steamed out the next morning, it saw the Monitor right next to the USS Minnesota to protect it. The Confederates couldn't believe their eyes. They thought it was a boiler on a raft to be taken in for repair. When the boiler ran out of gun and fired on them, and that led to 4 hours of combat between the Virginia and the Monitor.
So this was that one chance where here they are, these 2 top secret weapons, the same bay, the same battle, and they duked it out for 4 hours. And so for 4 hours, basically point blank range, firing away, pounding each other, cannonball dents, armor, just an incredible battle, smoke, noise.
The battle was essentially a draw, both ships returning with little damage.
But the Monitor had really won a tactical victory because its mission was to protect the rest of the Union fleet there, and it accomplished that mission.
After the Battle of Hampton Roads, in which the capabilities of the vessel, were proved, and it was proven to be a great technology, that's when there was a cachet of, hey, I served aboard the Monitor, or, so Lincoln came and visited the vessel. He actually walked on board, and the crew, they seem to have a little bit of swagger about them. They maybe still don't necessarily like serving on that vessel, but because it's the Monitor, because it participated in this famous battle, they were kind of viewed as celebrities.
2 years later, Charleston was under siege.
The city had almost not a window pane left. Shellings almost nightly.
Undersea warfare was something people had talked about. There had been submarines that had functioned one fashion or another, and that had gone on for a long, long time. But finally, here comes a little submarine, 8 guys cranking it, 1 guy kind of poking his head out of the porthole.
The H.L Hunley was a privateer built in Mobile, Alabama, and sent via train to Charleston. The builders, including Horace Hunley himself, drew the attention of General P.T. Beauregard, who was leading the defense of Charleston.
The propulsion system was hand crank. There were 7 crank positions inside the submarine. The crew would sit all on one side, on the port side. There was a ballast system, forward and aft. Between the 2 conning towers or hatches, you had a crew compartment. Separating the crew compartment from the bow and the stern were bulkheads. They had dive planes on either side to pitch the submarine up and down. And then if they wanted to come back to the surface, they could pump the water out of the ballast tanks with 2 hand pumps.
Story is they would go get about $50,000 for every federal vessel that they could sink.
Fort Sumter was under attack and Charleston was falling. General Beauregard seized the submarine and manned it with his own inexperienced crew.
While boarding or unboarding, one of them steps down on the dive lever. The sub rotates, takes 6 down, 5 die. But having realized the error of his ways, he pleads with Captain Hunley, the chief financier, to come take the submarine back. Crew it with volunteers. You do it.
The sub was raised, a new crew trained. Hunley himself was in the captain's chair, but without his first captain, whose job it was to light a candle, the only source of light inside the long iron tube.
The boat dives into the depths of the Cooper River. It becomes pitch black in there. He can't find the seacock to turn off the front hatch. Water's flowing in, the boat becomes nose heavy, gets stuck in the bottom of the Cooper River in 32 feet of water. There, half of them suffocate, half drown.
The first 2 crews in practice, they would go out, practice, come in, practice, and then a crew would die. And they would haul the Hunley back up to the surface, get the guys out, and it may or may not be true, but stories of having to cut the bodies apart to get them out.
In fact, the bodies of the first crew were found 133 years later in an old mariners' cemetery, now a football field. 2 graves had multiple body parts inside. 1 grave contained just 1 set of remains.
One was a Confederate sailor of color, and the color of his skin, they didn't get the body parts mixed up. They did with the other ones.
For 3 weeks in October of 1863, the Hunley rested on the bottom of the river, Beauregard unwilling to devote more men or money to what had twice become a tomb.
Now enters Lieutenant George Dixon, a young man who's seen the submarine, knows Captain Hunley, comes to General Beauregard and says, please let me have the submarine. I can make it work.
It was never designed to be a deep water sailing vessel. It was designed to fight in the coastal areas.
That battle told us that from that day forward, the wooden walls, the wooden navies of the past were the past. If you wanted to stay competitive, you would have to build ironclads.
Once the Monitor proved its success, they were looked upon as heroes.
Officers' quarters aboard the Monitor were surprisingly luxurious, and there was a daily mail call.
Dear Anna, and I thought we could continue our chat with pen, ink, and paper.
The odd little ship's routines were chronicled by crew's letters to their wives.
Lunch at 12, of whiskey and crackers, which I don't partake, but I'm sorry to say, all the rest do. Supper at 6, which is usually bread and butter, dried beef, cheese, crackers, coffee, and tea.
On Christmas Eve, 1862, the Monitor received orders to head to Beaufort, South Carolina, then possibly to Charleston.
It was never designed to be a deep water, blue water sailing vessel. It was designed to fight in the coastal areas, you know, what we call the littoral zone today, rivers and bays and harbors. And was designed to be towed from place to place.
As the year 1862 wound to a close, the crew aboard the now somewhat famous Monitor, under tow by USS Rhode Island, was in grand spirits. Even as bad weather forced them below, they cheered uproariously as their ship became the first ironclad to round Cape Hatteras. The storm worsened. Waves crashed against the turret, causing it to vibrate and leak. As evening wore on, the storm's thrashing finally snapped one of the hawsers, causing the flat, top-heavy vessel to roll wildly. Greenville Weeks, the Surgeon General aboard, later shared his account.
Solid iron from keels onto turret top, clinging to anything for safety. If the Monitor should go down, would only ensure a share in her fate.
Water began overwhelming the Worthington bilge pumps and dousing the fires which fueled the boat's engines.
Ocean claimed our little vessel, and her trembling frame and failing fire proved she would soon answer his call.
The Monitor's captain, John Bankhead, considered distress signals a last resort, but ordered the Red Lantern hoisted around 10 that night. The Rhode Island responded by sending lifeboats, but the treacherous sea overwhelmed them.
It is madness to remain here longer. Let each man save himself.
It was only then that Surgeon General Weeks made a desperate leap for a lifeboat, which now crashed about dangerously beside the sinking Monitor. Just as he jumped, a swell seized the boat upwards and away, but Weeks was dragged aboard at Lieutenant Samuel Green's command. Aboard the Rhode Island, the doctor himself was treated for a dislocated shoulder and 3 smashed fingers were amputated.
For an hour or more, we watched from the deck of the Rhode Island the lonely light upon the Monitor's turret. 100 times we thought it gone forever. 100 times it reappeared, till at last, about 2 o'clock Wednesday morning, it sank and we saw it no more.
People have said, well, was it a poor design? It was a great design. It just wasn't designed to sustain those type of, sustain itself in those type of conditions.
The real tragedy was that what enemy fire could not accomplish in the conflict with the Virginia and with other Confederate ships and fortifications, Mother Nature did when it sank the Monitor on the last day of 1862.
47 men were rescued that night. 16 were either washed overboard or trapped inside the ship.
Our little vessel was lost, and we, who in months gone by had learned to love her, felt a strange pang go through us as we remembered that never more might we tread on her deck or gather in her little cabin at evening.
It would be 111 years before any human detected signal or sign of the USS Monitor again.
Not once, not twice, 3 times, people from all over the world came to Charleston to lift the siege on a city that was longer than the siege on Stalingrad and Leningrad in World War II. And they did so really fulfilling what the great book says is the greatest gift that any one of us can give.
Why would somebody volunteer to climb into the Hunley? To get down there, contort their bodies to get into this little metal tube with no lights and no source of, no source of air to breathe, nothing to breathe. Once they hatch that, batten down the hatch on that thing, you're down to a very short period of time that you can sustain life.
Twice, the H.L Hunley had plummeted to the ocean floor, killing its crew. Lieutenant George Dixon convinced Beauregard the sinkings were not the result of poor design, but of clumsy operation.
George Dixon came back and said, no, give us one more chance. I'll get a 3rd crew together. Now, who are these crazy guys to get in this death machine, right? That is fascinating. None of them are from Charleston. None of them are from even South Carolina. 4 of them are from Alabama, Florida, Virginia, North Carolina. But then we have another 4 crewmen who were immigrants. The crew of the Hunley is a really interesting cross-section of American society at the time. Half the crew on board the Hunley are speaking with, accents, other than Southern accents, The purpose of the submarine was, again, to dive beneath a target ship. And so they were intending to dive, but they weren't intending to dive deep or for very long. The goal really was just to get underneath the surface of the water and get underneath the ship that they were attacking.
Dixon, by most accounts a flamboyant ladies' man who had previously served in the Confederate infantry, would captain the sub.
He was the one who would navigate the submarine. He had a depth gauge, a compass. He controlled the valves for the forward ballast tank to let water in. He controlled the dive planes, and he was the only one that would be looking out the viewing ports and guiding the submarine toward this target. So basically, they would line up on a target, move forward, and then dive underneath it.
It's not known exactly how the detonation system worked, but essentially a torpedo-type explosive was mounted at the end of a spar which projected from the bow. The idea was to ram the spar into the enemy ship below its waterline.
She's a great piece of technology. She bumped up on the technological limits of the day. She's 50 years ahead of her time in hydrodynamic design. She's got an air system, the world's first joystick steering. She's got a crew compartment that had a 3-to-1 gear ratio. It's got skylights not known to exist at that time.
Confederate naval forces were growing ever more desperate to break the Union's blockade of the Charleston harbor. Dixon and his crew made the 1,240-ton USS Housatonic their target. The sloop carried 12 cannons and a crew of 150. Under cover of darkness, the Hunley slipped low into the water at the breach inlet, moving out around the Housatonic, which was moored bound north. Conning tower exposed, Dixon maneuvered the sub to aim for the ship's starboard aft, then submerged to plan its lethal blow.
And it worked to great effect. The Housatonic sank within minutes. 5
Union sailors were killed, but many survived in the shallow waters by clinging to rigging. Accounts from those survivors vary, some reporting the Hunley was hit by small arms fire before they submerged. Others report seeing the Hunley surface after the attack, signaling shore of their success with a white or blue light.
We don't know exactly what happened, but the Hunley never came back. We want to complete that story. We want to tell all the aspects and everything that we can discover about the Hunley and what happened that fateful night, February 17th, 1864.
The Hunley was something that kind of mystified people. It's something like, people wanted to find the Titanic. People wanted to find the Hunley.
At one point, we got a very strong magnetometer hit.
Clyde Smith went along on several search expeditions run and financed by author Clive Cussler in the early 90s.
We had 4 square miles, Housatonic at the very middle, and what we just ran up and down across these 1 mile squares. And we were running lanes, if you will, like mowing the lawn.
The mag hit was significant enough to launch divers. Smith went down to help stake out their find.
We had 5-foot-long metal rods that could be screwed together. So we would go in there and we would pound these into the sand, and then we'd screw another rod and pound that in the sand thing. And we ended up with an elliptical shape pattern of all these little rods sticking up that was the length we were looking for, 34, 35 feet or something, and it was sort of a cigar-shaped pattern.
They uncovered a corner of the metal object, but determined that the sort of rivet they exposed belonged to a sunken buoy. They abandoned the site. Years later, Cussler returned and dug a little deeper.
And they dug out some more, and that time they found one of the hatches. And that's when we knew it was the Hunley. When it was time to find it, it was found. So, that's how that worked.
And I said, we ought to go get that submarine. We sent a site assessment out to take a look and see, do we have a rusted hulk? Is it gone on the bottom? We don't know anything about its construction. All the records are gone and everything.
But we could see through the viewing ports that the entire inside of the submarine was full of sediment. So we knew we were going to have preservation of the material that we would find inside. For example, the crew's remains were entombed in mud inside an iron coffin, which was then buried.
They said an anaerobic environment had set up inside, an oxygenless environment, very early in the history of the vessel. And so they warned us that we could encounter skin, hair, and flesh in the recovery.
Suspecting how well preserved the contents of the sub likely were didn't make the recovery any easier. In fact, it made it all the more delicate. It took several years for engineers to come up with a way to move the vessel without liquefying what lay inside.
We have only one chance to do this, and to do it right.
Suction pilings were used to create a foundation which supported slings, cocooning the vessel in the same starboard leaning position in which it was found.
We knew we had one design weakness, and that was that the 4 legs of that superstructure had to hit a moving barge at one time, or 2 Gs would go through it and damage everything. So they were holding the submarine up there over that moving barge. And what we did is we created a 28-second window of smooth water with a dredge barge. And as that traveled under that moving barge and that thing stabilized, that crane operator had to pop it and drop it on there with all 4. And I'll never forget that loud, loud thump. And then we knew we had them.
It was unbelievable. Yeah, it was like this incredible, thing that finally, after all these years, well over 100 years, and here it comes out of the water.
It's a wonderful day because it was about 4 miles in to Charleston's harbor. And when we got near the harbor and came down the jetties, the Catholic Church, Stella Maris, on Sullivan's Island began ringing its bell. And then the other churches in the city started ringing their bells. And on rooftops, there were hundreds of boats going by us. The rooftops across Charleston, the people on roofs and everything, on the Battery. They were at the aquarium, they were all over the Yorktown. The traffic came to a halt on the big Cooper River Bridge, and people are looking over the sides. And it's as though just time stood still for the Hunley to complete the final journey home.
Coming up on the next Recon Secrets of the Sea Part 2.
The crew so well preserved in their bone structure. Their brains are still in their heads.
Inside the H.L Hunley.
$100.
What?
I bet you $100 I can feel it. That's what it is.
It was completely covered inside the man. It was concreted.
We apply the same basic investigative techniques as crime scene investigators. We're doing the same thing, we're just doing it for extremely cold cases.
And the cheese box is discovered on the ocean floor.
At some point, the turret became dislodged and was lying underneath the ship.
The first time I saw it was pretty incredible. We went down and dove on the site, and there, clear as day, was one set of human remains.
Even after 150 years, that the nation's commitment to bring you home is as good today as it was during the Civil War.
All on the next Recon, Secrets of the Sea.